There was a moment, one single moment, when I realized that the greatest test of my faith was not going to come from outside my community. It was going to come from inside my own heart. And the most frightening part was that I never saw it coming, because the test arrived wearing the face of an honor. I remember standing in Bishop Yoder's kitchen, hands folded, head slightly bowed, listening to him explain why the elders had chosen me. And instead of feeling purely grateful, which is what I told everyone, I felt there was something else moving underneath that gratitude, something quiet, something I would spend the next several months trying very hard to ignore. I was born and raised in a small Amish settlement in eastern Ohio. My parents were plain people in every sense of the word. My father farmed, my mother kept the home and raised 7 children, and I was the fourth. We woke before sunrise every single morning. We prayed before every meal and again before sleep. We believed that the purpose of a life was not to discover yourself, but to surrender yourself to God, to family, to community. That was the foundation of everything I understood about being human. I was taught from the time I could understand words that temptation was something you avoided. You did not walk near the edge and test your footing. You stayed far from the cliff. You kept your eyes forward and your heart guarded, and if you did those things faithfully, your life would stay on the right path. That belief felt like safety to me for a long time. It felt like wisdom, and I never questioned it until the year the elders chose me for something I had never expected. My life up to that point was simple, and I mean that with no bitterness. I loved my life. I helped my mother with the younger children. I worked alongside our neighbors during harvest season. I was known in our community as someone you could count on. If a family needed meals brought after a birth or a loss, I was there. If there was organizing to be done for a gathering, people called on me. I was not exceptional in any dramatic way. I was just steady. And in our community, being steady carries its own kind of honor. So when Bishop Yoder and 2 of the other elders approached my father first, and then sat down with me to explain the situation, I understood why they had thought of me. Our community had agreed to participate in something that was new and, honestly, a little uncomfortable for many of the older members. A regional heritage outreach program had been established connecting Amish communities with local historical organizations to help document traditional crafts, farming methods, and family histories. The goal was preservation, not spectacle. And someone needed to serve as the primary community liaison, someone who could be trusted to represent us with dignity, to communicate clearly, and to maintain our values while engaging with people from outside our world. They chose me. I was 26 years old, not yet married, though that was a conversation my mother had begun raising with increasing frequency. I was considered mature, responsible, and this is the word Bishop Yoder used, measured. He said I had a measured spirit, and I held on to those words like they were a gift because I believed I had earned them. The role was not dramatic at first. I attended planning meetings held at a community center about 30 minutes from our settlement. I helped answer questions, review documents, and provide information about our practices and history. It felt meaningful, it felt like service, and I was proud, quietly, humbly proud, in the way that our tradition permits. That is when I met Daniel. He was not Amish. He was an archivist and researcher working with the historical organization, a man in his early 30s, soft-spoken and careful with his words. He wore plain clothes, though not our kind of plain. He had a serious manner and patient eyes, and from the very beginning he treated me with a respect that I was not entirely prepared for. Not because English people had never been respectful to me, many had been, but because Daniel's respect felt different. He listened to me the way people listen when they actually want to understand, not just when they are waiting for their turn to speak. Our interactions were entirely appropriate, always in public spaces, always surrounded by other people, always professional, but conversations have a way of deepening when 2 people are genuinely curious about each other. He asked me thoughtful questions about my life, not the surface questions most outsiders ask, but real questions about what I valued, what brought me joy, what I found difficult. And without quite realizing what was happening, I found myself answering honestly. I told him things I had never said out loud, that sometimes the sameness of my days felt heavy even though I loved the life I was living, that I had always been drawn to history, not just our own, but the wider sweep of it. that I sometimes wondered what it felt like to pursue a single interest deeply, the way scholars did, that I had notebooks at home filled with observations and questions I had never shown anyone. He looked at me after I said that, and he said, very quietly, "That sounds like a researcher's mind." 3 words, and they broke something open inside me that I had been keeping very carefully sealed for years. I told myself it was just connection, intellectual connection, nothing more. I told myself I was handling it well, that I was behaving with exactly the measured spirit Bishop Yoder had recognized in me. I went home after those meetings and sat in my kitchen and told myself that everything was fine. But then I started noticing how much I looked forward to those meetings. Not the work, though I valued the work, but the conversations afterward, when the formal portion ended and a few of us would linger over coffee. I noticed how quickly the time passed when Daniel and I were talking. I noticed how flat the evenings felt when I returned home and tried to describe my days to my mother and could not find the words for what was happening inside me. And then one afternoon, about 3 months into the program, Daniel stayed after the others had left. He pulled out a folder and said he wanted to show me something. It was a formal proposal, a fellowship opportunity connected to the historical organization, designed for community members who demonstrated deep knowledge of traditional practices and a capacity for detailed documentation. He said he had spoken to his supervisors. He said he had recommended me specifically. He said if I were interested, it would mean traveling occasionally, working more independently, and developing skills that were entirely mine. He said it so gently, like he was offering a window and not a door, like he understood exactly what he was placing in front of me. I went home that night and I did not sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, my father's breathing through the walls, the wind against the wooden shutters, the small sounds of a life I had always trusted, and I felt something I can only describe as grief, not because anything had been lost, but because I was suddenly aware of a version of myself I had never met, and she was standing just on the other side of something I could not cross. That was my lowest point. Not the feelings themselves, but the recognition that I could not simply wish them away. I had been taught that you avoided temptation by keeping your distance from it. Nobody had told me what to do when the temptation grew from something you were doing right, from a role you had been trusted with, from a version of yourself that felt real. I prayed more during those weeks than I had in years. Not the rote prayers of habit, but desperate, searching prayers where I was genuinely asking God to help me see clearly. And slowly, through that honesty, something began to shift. I realized that what I felt for Daniel was real, but it was also revealing something deeper that had nothing to do with him specifically. The feeling I had been mistaking for attachment was actually longing for the parts of myself I had believed I was not allowed to have. The curiosity, the intellectual hunger, the desire to be known beyond my usefulness to others. Those things had always been inside me. Daniel had not created them. He had simply reflected them back in a way I could no longer ignore. And once I understood that, I could finally make a decision that was actually mine. I turned down the fellowship. Not out of fear, and not because I believed the opportunity was wrong for everyone, but because I understood with real clarity that accepting it would mean walking away from commitments that were genuinely part of who I was. Not obligations forced on me. My own commitments. That distinction mattered enormously. But I did not simply go back to the way things were before. I went to my mother and showed her the notebooks. I brought them to a women's circle in our community and read from them. I asked Bishop Yoder whether there was a way to keep contributing to the Heritage Program in a capacity that worked within the boundaries I chose to keep. He said yes. And something that had felt like it was tearing apart began slowly to hold together in a new shape. I also wrote Daniel a letter, handwritten, honest, and grateful. I told him what his respect had meant to me and what his reflection of my own potential had done inside my heart. I thanked him for seeing me clearly, and I wished him well. I did not ask for anything in return. The letter itself was enough. What I learned through all of it is this temptation is not always a monster trying to drag you somewhere terrible. Sometimes it is a mirror holding up a part of yourself you have been afraid to acknowledge. The real question is not whether you resist it or follow it. The real question is what it is trying to show you and whether you have the courage to look honestly at what you see. The role I was given was a genuine honor. The test it brought was a genuine test, and I am grateful for both because I came out of it knowing myself in a way I never had before. That knowledge does not make life simpler, but it makes it more honest. And in my tradition and in my heart, honesty has always been where faith begins. So I want to ask you something before you go. Has something that felt like a blessing ever unexpectedly become one of your biggest personal challenges? A promotion, a new relationship, a new role, a new opportunity, something that opened a door you were not prepared to walk through. I would love to hear your story in the comments. You might be surprised how many people need to hear exactly what you went through. And if this story moved you, if it touched something real in your heart, please share it with someone you know who might need it today. Sometimes we find the words for our own struggles by hearing someone else find theirs first. Thank you for listening. This was my story, and I am still grateful for every piece of it.